And now I'd like to introduce to you Dr. Keith Moore. Now, I may consume quite a bit of your time if I want to tell you all about Dr. Keith Moore. However, briefly, Dr. Moore is the Dean of the College of Medicine at the University of Toronto in Canada. He is a professor of embryology, has been professor for 20 years in the University of Manitoba in Winnipeg, and he has been the chairman of the department for 11 years. Dr. Moore has written about 7 books actually, 4 books in embryology, 1 in neuroanatomy, and 2 in gross anatomy. Dr. Moore is a fellow of International Academy of Psychology. He's the president of the American Association of Clinical Anatomists, and his books are being taught in the medical schools throughout the world, not only in this country or Canada, but throughout the world. And his research in the embryology field is very outstanding. I believe that you will find it so when we listen to Dr. Moore. May we welcome Dr. Moore.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very pleased to be here. When I was first called about attending this meeting, I didn't think it was going to be possible for me to do so, but I didn't realize at the time that it was the Students' Association that was inviting me here. Had I known that, I probably would have accepted right away, because I get a lot of invitations from students groups across Canada, United States, and I try to accept as many of those invitations as I can. So I want to tell you about some studies that I and others have done in the last 10 years. I first became aware of the Qur'an about 10 years ago when I visited Saudi Arabia at the invitation of King Abdulaziz University to lecture in embryology. And at that time I was asked about some of the meaning of some of the verses in the Qur'an, and I tried to interpret them as best I could, and that really started a study which has lasted for about 10 years in a part-time way, and I've been happy to tell people about these findings, because it's been very inspiring to me, because I've always been interested in the history of embryology, and some of the early history is not very well known to us. Now I'm going to follow my notes fairly closely so that I won't talk too long. So I want to start then with the historical background, and the first scientific studies in embryology, as far as we know, were done by the Greek scientists in the 5th century BC. Hippocrates, who we know as the father of medicine, and after whom the Hippocratic Oath is named, was one of the first to write books on embryology. And later Aristotle, another famous Greek philosopher and scientist, studied chick embryos, actually opened eggs and was able to study the development. Concluded at that time, and this is 4th and 5th century BC, that man's development, that is human development, was similar to that of the chicken. The writings of Aristotle and Galen, another scientist, dominate the early part of our historical record, and from the time of Galen, around 200 AD, until the 16th century, no major advances in our knowledge of embryology were recorded in the literature of Western science. This is mainly because these kind of studies were forbidden in those very dark ages. Consequently, as far as we know, until the revelations in the Qur'an, man was relatively ignorant about his reproduction and development. It was not until the invention of the microscope in the 17th century that any significantly new information was added to the field of embryology. Before this time, the fetus was said to develop from a coagulum of human blood and the seed. There's really no idea of how we developed, but in the days of Aristotle, they believed, as Sheikh Mustafa Ahmed said, that menstrual blood was the thought to give rise to the embryo, and that they really didn't know anything about spermatozoa or sperms. But when the microscope was discovered, if we could have that first slide. Now, these early microscopes were very primitive by our standards today. This first slide, I don't know whether they're going to, can you see those? Well, that's a picture of Aristotle there, one of the earliest writers in human embryology. Maybe the microscope could come on. Yeah, this is the microscope that was invented by Leeuwenhoek in 1694. And this is a very crude microscope. As you can see, the object, whatever it was you were looking at, was put on the end of a needle point, and there was a small magnifying glass, and you would look at this, but it didn't give very much magnification. It'd be equivalent to what you would get now if you used a magnifying glass. So it wouldn't give very much enlargement. So this is the state of knowledge in the 17th century, and it would not be possible for them to see the early stages of human development even at that time. Now, when they did see what they thought was a sperm, they thought that this sperm, and if we could just have, they visualized this sperm with a little imagination, that inside that sperm or male germ cell was a little human being. And all it needed was for it to be implanted in the female, and in the environment of the mother's uterus, this would stimulate this little person to start developing. And so the real role of the female then was to give this little embryo a place to develop and to stimulate it. Now, I should say, in fairness, there were others who believed that the female ovary, the oocytes or eggs, they contained the little human being. So there was two groups. One said the little human being was in a sperm. Others said it was in the oocyte or egg, and that when they started to develop, then this little person just got bigger. So that shows you what our knowledge was like in the 17th century. The fact that the sperm and the ovum were necessary for conception was not known until the 18th century, when there were further refinements in our optical instruments, and microscopes were better developed and so on, and so they were actually able to see the sperm and the egg and realize then that they actually came together in a process which was called fertilization. Now, later in the development of embryology, they developed the idea of stages. And the first attempts to arrange human embryos in stages were made towards the end of the 19th century. And these efforts continued during the early part of the 20th century. In 1914, Dr. Moll in this country arranged 266 human embryos in a series of stages. 28 years later, Dr. Streeter, also of the United States, classified human embryos in 23 stages, which he called developmental horizons. Now, Streeter's classifications were used worldwide until 1973, when Dr. Ronan O'Reilly, who's at University of San Diego, developed a more detailed system for classifying human embryos, particularly during the first 3 weeks of development. Now, these Carnegie stages, that is named after the Carnegie Institute of Embryology, have received international approval and are based on various developmental events and morphological criteria. And these timetables of human development are from my book, which I developed in about 1970, based on the Carnegie stages of human development. And at this time, when I did these stages, I had no awareness that there was anything about human development in the Qur'an. So it's only then in the last 15 to 20 years that we've had a good knowledge of the stages of human development. Now, this knowledge has increased rapidly in the last few years. Now, a major difficulty in the classification of terminology is the fact that the shape of the embryo is continuously changing. The principles for nomenclature and for terminology for descriptive embryology are the terms that are applied to a particular development which would be descriptive of what the embryo really looks like. There should also be full agreement between the term and the nature of the development and events occurring at that stage. In order to avoid confusion, each term should define a stage which has a clear beginning and an end, as is possible, in order to avoid any overlap between stages, or on the other hand, to avoid any gaps between one stage and another. Now, it was about this time that I began to study the Qur'an and to look at verses referring to embryology. So I found that there was a large terminology in the Qur'an referring to human development. Now, until recently, it was not known that this holy book of the Muslims and the Sunnah, or Hadith, the teachings of Muhammad, contain many citations referring to the stages of human development. Until recently, these statements were not clearly understood, since they referred to details in development which were scientifically unknown in earlier times. In fact, the Islamic system for classifying human embryos is amazing, since it was recorded in the 7th century A.D. Although Aristotle, as I mentioned before, the founder of the science of embryology, realized that chick embryos developed in stages from hen's eggs in the 4th century, he did not give any details about these stages. Also, the early human embryo is of such a minute size that detailed studies would have been impossible without the microscope. In the very early stages of human development, the first few days, it's so small that you could just barely see it. In other words, it's about the size of a period at the end of a sentence. And you could realize how, without our modern microscopes, you would not be able to see any of those details of the early stages. Now, as far as we know from the history of embryology, little was known about the staging and classification of human embryos until the last 100 years, as I've just mentioned. Moreover, the Quranic terminology fulfills the principles for nomenclature and terminology. For this reason, the descriptions of human embryos in the Quran cannot be based on scientific knowledge in the 7th century. The only reasonable conclusion is that these descriptions were revealed to Muhammad, peace be upon him, by God. He could not have known such details because he was an illiterate man. He was not a scientist or an embryology, and he did not have scientific training. Now, in the following passages from the Quran, we introduce the concept of stages in human development. And this first verse was the first one that was shown to me. And you can read that there. God created man from a quintessence of clay. He then placed him as a nutfa, a droplet, in a place of settlement, firmly fixed. Then we make the nutfa into an alaka, a leech-like structure, and then he changed the alaka into a mudga, a chewed-like substance. Then we made out of that mudga isam, I can't read too well here, skeleton, and then we clothed the bones with muscles. Then we caused him to grow, and then we came into bone, into being and attain the definitive human form. So blessed be God, the best to create. This is from one of the surahs. So, we have the next one, I believe, that shows this is the Islamic. Now, this are the stages that we found in the Qur'an, and it's taken a lot of study and discussion to arrive at the meaning of these stages. The first one is the nutfa, or the drop stage, and then the second is the klaq, or shaping stage, and then the nasha, or the growth stage. Now, the proposed system is clear, it's comprehensive, and conforms with present embryological knowledge. And it's our hope that this terminology can be introduced internationally. But if nothing more, at least the Muslim science students can realize that the stages that we talk about in our embryology textbooks are the same. It's just that they have different names. Now, the principles for the terminology then, that they be descriptive of appearance, and that they reflect the processes occurring, and that they be avoid ambiguous beginning and an end. In other words, they should be clear as to what these stages refer to. And this was actually the first verse that was ever read to me when I was in Saudi Arabia, and I'd never. I knew that the Qur'an existed, but I'd never read it before. And when they asked me what this verse meant to me, I said, well, it was obvious. It makes you in the wombs of your mother, which is the uterus, of course. Womb is simply English translation of the Latin uterus, in your mother's in stages. So here is talking about stages, which is similar to what Hippocrates and Aristotle had talked about, one after another in 3 veils of darkness. Then I was asked what this 3 veils of darkness might be, and it occurred to me that it might be, as I've indicated here in these slides, that the first veil of darkness around this developing human would probably be the anterior abdominal wall, that is the skin, muscles, and so on around the mother, forming the wall, anterior wall of the mother's abdomen. 2, I thought, would be the wall of the uterus, the organ which contains the embryo, and then inside that uterus we have other membranes which we call the amnion and the chorion, and we combine that because they fuse together. We call it the amniochorionic membrane. Now, this was my initial interpretation of this, and I've heard many different other interpretations of what these veils of darkness are, and I don't suppose we will ever know exactly what that verse meant. But this interpretation has been accepted by some of the prominent embryologists around the world. And I have invited my friends, as mentioned, Dr. Johnson from Jefferson Medical College, Dr. Prasad from Winnipeg, Dr. Edwards from Cambridge, who some of you remember Steptoe and Edwards. Dr. Edwards were the first ones to produce a baby in vitro, and little Louise Brown was the first one. And Dr. Edwards agreed with our interpretations of this. So, and then we went on and studied other verses. Now this shows the description of the mother and the relationship, the mother to the conceptus. Conceptus is simply the developing embryo plus the membranes that are around it. And that is the nutfa, is the related to the conceptus, and these other stages referring to the uterus and so on. These are all terms that are in the Qur'an. And we then placed him as a nutfa, or a drop, in a place of settlement firmly fixed. When I was asked what this would mean, I obviously thought of the settlement or implantation of the early human embryo, which we call a blastocyst, into the lining of the uterus. The nutfa stage involves the sperm and the ovum and their union to form the fertilized zygote, the cell division to form the blastocyst, and the implantation into the uterus. Now the shaping stage is further divided into alaka, as I mentioned, mudka, islam, and lam stages. During the latter part of this stage, the embryo also develops a human appearance and undergoes a straightening of its bodily form. The growth stage includes what is now known as the fetal period of human development, involves modification in the bodily proportions, the development of the individual appearances or features, and the growth and refinement of the various organ stages. Now we'll look at the nutfa stage, which is the initial stage, which is what in ordinary embryology we would call the zygote. The word nutfa means a small amount of fluid or a drop of it. As the first stage is called the nutfa, it includes 5 phases or substages which involve the mixing of male and female germinal fluids, fertilization, implantation, and early cell division. And so we'll deal then with the phases of the nutfa. And the first is the mani. It's been discovered that the first stage is formed from a part of the male fluid, that is the nutfa of the father, which includes the sperm, and part of the female fluid, which is the nutfa of the mother, which includes the ovum. Now the Arabic term mani is used mainly to describe the sperm, although it is also used to describe both the sperm and the ovum. During the fertilization process, the male fluid travels from the vagina up through the uterus and meets the female fluid in the uterine tube or oviduct, or as some people call it, the fallopian tube. According to the Islamic statements, fertilization does not occur from all of the fluids, from the male and the female, but from a minute portion of them. As the Qur'an states, was he not a drop of germinal fluid, mani, emitted? And mani here refers to the sperm and the ovum. Other components of the male and female fluids aid in the fertilization process. The semen, that is the mixture of sperms and fluids, contain hormones called prostaglandins, which induce the uterine contractions, and they may aid in the transport of the sperm to the fertilization site. Important components of the female fluid also contribute to this process. During the female fertile phase of the woman's menstrual cycle, the cervical mucus, which is otherwise fairly impervious to sperm, becomes clear and gel-like through a realignment of its molecules and allows the sperms to pass. Enzymes secreted by the linings of the uterus and the oviducts capacitate, that is, they remove a covering from the sperm, which are called glycoproteins, and this enables it to then participate in fertilization. Sperms are unable to fertilize ova unless they've been capacitated. Additionally, enzymes are secreted by the oviducts, which loosen the follicular cells surrounding the ovum and expose its protective membrane to the sperm. The fact that the fluids of the male and the female are involved with fertilization was mentioned in the following hadith. When the Prophet, peace be upon him, was asked by a Jewish person, "O Muhammad, what is man created from?" the Prophet answered, "O Jew, he is created from both, from the fluid of the man and the fluid of the woman." Thus, the word nutfa used in the hadith is a very comprehensive term. Now, the next term is called sulala. This refers to the selection from the male and the female fluids, as the following passage mentions. Not from all fluid is the offspring created. And when I was asked about this, I explained that when we develop, we only develop from a small portion. Thus, the creation from both fluids occurs through a special selection. The Quranic term for this selection is sulala, which means in Arabic gentle extraction from fluid. It is now known that both the ovum and the sperm are gently extracted from their environments in the process of fertilization. The ovum is selected from a long stream of follicular fluid, while one sperm out of millions is selected from the seminal fluid. The first sperm which touches the cell membrane of the ovum enters easily, but immediately afterwards a rapid change occurs in the cell membrane, selecting that sperm only, and all other sperms are locked out. Now, talk again about the nutfa or nutfa amshad. The fertilized ovum, or zygote as we call it, takes the form of a drop, or a nutfa amshad, which is a drop of mingled fluid. As God says in the Qur'an, we created man from a drop of mingled fluid, that is the nutfa amshad. An important point with regard to this phrase is the fact that nutfa is a singular noun, while amshad is a plural modifying adjective. According to the conventional rules of grammar, singular nouns are normally modified by singular adjectives, and thus the term nutfa amshad was a mystery to early Quranic scholars. However, this peculiarity in the language can now be explained, since we now know that the zygote remains singular as a nutfa, while internally the chromosomes and other contributions from the sperm and ovum form a plural mixture described as amshad. Therefore, from a scientific point of view, amshad is entirely accurate as a plural adjective modifying the singular nutfa, which is really a multifaceted entity, single entity. This stage continues in development, maintaining the shape of the nutfa, but dividing it into smaller and smaller cells called blastomeres. Until about 4 days later, it forms a spherical mass of cells known as a morula. 5 days after fertilization, the nutfa then forms a blastocyst as the morula cells separate into two parts. During this time, the term amshad very appropriately applies to the nutfa in all of its developments, since it continues to be a multifaceted entity. The next stage is called takdir. In the early formation of the nutfa amshad, the chromosomes form from both parents, and they mix, and that is what gives rise to the human embryo. This genetic mixture will determine the characteristics of the child as well as the child's sex. As the Qur'an mentions, He created him from nutfa and immediately laid down the plan or the program of his future development. He created him then agrees completely with our understanding. We know that the chromosomes from the mother and the father unite at fertilization, and that we are then a mixture of the chromosomes of our mothers and fathers. And that this is all determined at this very early stage of nutfa. And we didn't understand that until probably about in the 1920s. Now, the last stage of this early development is called hearth. In the last phase of the nutfa amshad, the blastocyst implants into the endometrium, or the lining of the uterus. This passage from the Qur'an states, "Your wives are a tilth or a hearth unto you, so approach your tilth when or how you will." Tilth or hearth refers to cultivation of the soil. So it's clear that an understanding of the lining of the uterus, or what we call the endometrium, was very much like soil, that when the blastocyst implants, it gets its nourishment from the mother's blood, just as a plant, roots of a plant, get its nourishment from the soil. The last step of the nutfa stage begins with implantation of the blastocyst and is called the hearth phase. The Qur'an considers this process analogous to the cultivation of the soil and the lining of the uterus like soil in which the seed develops. Indeed, the blastocyst embeds and roots itself into the endometrium with cells which will eventually form the placenta, just as the seed embeds itself in the soil. This shows the uterus at the top, and the red area, which is blown up in the bottom, is the lining of the endometrium of the uterus, into which the blastocyst, or early human embryo, implants, and it gets its nourishment from those blood vessels and mother's blood, which carries the oxygen and nutrient substances to it. And the comparison then to a seed developing in the soil is a very accurate one. So that the development and the structural changes which occur during the nutfa stage are virtually impossible to detect without a microscope due to the minute size of the nutfa. And if we look at the next pictures there, I guess at the end of that portion. So this is the first part of my presentation, and we'll have an opportunity for you to ask questions. Thank you very much. And next we'll deal with the shaping stage, which is called Khalq, K-H-A-L-Q, and the first part of that is the Alaka stage. This second or shaping stage begins as the Alaka, which is an Arabic word meaning a leech. And when I was first asked about this, did the human embryo look like a leech? And when I thought about this for a few minutes, I realized that it resembled the leech very closely, as you will see. During the early stage, the embryo loses its rounded shape and elongates until it takes the shape of a leech. And this picture here, I went over to our library and got out a book on leeches and had my artist draw that exactly from the textbook showing a leech. And here is a human embryo here, and they're on the 21, 22 days. And I think you have to agree that they look very much alike. In fact, you see that the leech has segments, just like a worm, and the human embryo has these same segments. In fact, we still have a remnant of those segments in our bodies. If any of you have ever had shingles, ever heard of anyone having shingles, you always get the eruptions and bands across the area that's infected, and those bands are the remnants of those segments. So this is what I believe to be the leech-like appearance of the human embryo. And I believe in my descriptions in my book, I talk about it having a leech-like appearance. The similarity between the embryo and a leech is amazing. The embryo is attached to the wall of the chorionic sac, which is attached by chorionic villi to the endometrium or lining of the uterus. And so the human embryo is attached to the lining of the uterus, just like a leech will attach to your skin. I don't know whether you have leeches here or not, but we have certain lakes in Canada. If you go in swimming, these leeches will attach to your skin and suck the blood. So the analogy there is quite amazing. Initially, the embryo acquires a primitive circulatory and nervous system during this early stage. Thus, the term alaka refers to the leech-like external appearance of the embryo, as well as to its clinging relationship to the uterus, and is an appropriately descriptive term for this stage. Another meaning mentioned by the interpreters for alaka is similar to a blood clot. And the external appearance of the embryo during this phase is similar to that of blood due to the appearance of the primitive heart and the cardiovascular system. If you look at the picture at the bottom, it shows an embryo of about 22 or 23 days, and the bottom is the yolk sac, and the embryo is the part at the top, and you see all these blood vessels. And if you were to see an embryo at that stage, and I should say that most embryos will undergo spontaneous abortion at about this stage. In other words, when they're about 2 or 3 weeks old, they will often spontaneously abort. That means that they just are expelled from the mother's uterus without a known cause, although we've done a lot of studies on this and find that many of them have very abnormal chromosomes, and they couldn't have survived if they had lived. So, as we used to say in the old days, this was God's way of ridding the body of something that was very abnormal. But anyway, we do know that they are aborted at this early stage, and they do look like a clot of blood, because when they pull away from the uterus, then you have all these exposed blood vessels which have the bloody appearance. So this explains one interpretation for Alica as a blood clot. I prefer the one being a leech-like structure. Now, the blood does not circulate until the end of the 3rd week, but on the 21st day, the heart of the embryo connects with blood vessels in the embryo, the connecting stalk, and the chorion, and the blood starts to circulate, as you could see in this diagram in the bottom. Thus, the embryo takes the appearance of a blood clot, even though its blood is fluid, and these features incorporate the other meaning of a blood clot for the Alica phase. Now, the next stage is the Mudga stage, and again, when I was asked what this meant, it says, it reminded me of an embryo at this stage. And when I was told that the Mudga meant a chewed substance, I thought of the embryo here. You see these little bead-like structures, which we call somites. They are the beginning of what will be the vertebrae or the backbone. And I suggested that this chewed stage could be referring to these somites, which have the appearance of a chewed substance. If you take, as I did at that time, took a piece of gum and bit into it, and you're left with these teeth marks, which look very much like this. So this stage, the Mudga stage, occurs at about 26 to 27 days, and we call that the somite period in descriptive embryology. The transformation from the Alica to the Mudga is very rapid, and during the last day or two of the Alica stage, the embryo is beginning to develop some of the characteristics of the Mudga, that is, the somites begin to appear. The word Mudga means a piece of substance which has been chewed, and as used to describe this next phase of embryonic development, it should apply with the shape of a substance that the teeth have chewed. In fact, the appropriateness of this term Mudga has been indicated in modern embryology. It has been termed that after the formation of the embryo in the placenta, this stage, the embryo receives its nutrients and energy, thereby rapidly increasing the growth process. The bodily masses called somites, from which the bones and the muscle will form, start to appear. During the multitude of bead-like structures, or somites that are present, the embryo has the appearance of a substance that had been imprinted by teeth. The processes of this period can be recognized in the following points. First, the appearance of the somites, or the imprints, changes constantly, and just as the teeth imprints change on a substance with each act of chewing. The embryo changes its overall shape, but the structure derived from the somites remain. And secondly, the embryo turns in its position due to the modifications in its center of gravity with the new tissue formation, similar to the turning of a substance with chewing. And third, just as a chewed substance becomes curled before being swallowed, so does the back of the embryo become curved. And four, as the somites form, the internal features of the embryo in the Mudga stage are partly differentiated into organ anlaga, that means the beginning of structures, and partly undifferentiated. And this description is also stated in the Qur'an. Now, this is a later stage of Mudga. You can see the tail that we all had at that stage, and this little flipper-like structure is what's going to be your upper limb. And so this is the Mudga stage. The next slide. Then out of the chewed-like substance, partly differentiated and partly undifferentiated. And when I was asked what this surah meant, it said it's clear to me that an embryo at that stage is only partly differentiated. In other words, some of the organs, like the early development of the eye and the ear and the heart, some parts are well differentiated, others are poorly differentiated, and some are undifferentiated. And so we have this mixture which agrees exactly with this particular surah. Thus the term Mudga is very meaningful, since the embryo is a lump of irregularly shaped tissue at this stage, and a creation of systems is occurring while the overall process is incomplete. Some of the organs will form in the Mudga stage, and some will form in later stages. Now the next stage is called the Izam stage. This subsequent stage, phase of development, is referred to as Izam, which means bones, and the fetus does indeed acquire a cartilaginous skeleton after the Mudga stage. Those of you that have studied embryology realize that first of all you have what we call mesenchymal bones made out of connective tissue, then they become cartilaginous, and then they become ossified and become bones, solid bones. The formation of the bone does not begin uniformly throughout the body. Rather, there's a sequential appearance of bony tissue. In recent decades, the process of osteogenesis in the human embryo has been reasonably well documented. Bone development in the limbs commences in the embryonic limb buds from these mesenchymal or connective tissue cells. Primary ossification centers appear in the femur during the 5th week. The femur is your thigh bone. And in the sternum, it's breastbone, and the maxilla, jaw, during 8 to 9 weeks. The timing of the Izam phase has been mentioned in the following hadith. These simply show these various stages when, at this stage, the bones in the limb would be cartilaginous. The same here, you're starting to get little indications of the bones developing. And in this hadith says, when 42 nights have passed from the time of the nutfa, that is the time of conception, Allah sends an angel to it who shapes it and makes its ears, eyes, skin, muscles, and bones. In the early part of this phase, the embryo takes on a human appearance, Tazwir ad-Dami, and the hadith describes this with the word shapes. Before the 42nd day, it is difficult to distinguish the human embryo from the embryos of many animals, but at this stage it becomes clearly distinguishable in its appearance. I couldn't tell a mouse embryo from a human embryo or a rabbit embryo in those very early stages. So as this hadith is making clear, is that after this 40th day, when the angel sends an angel to it, which shapes it and so on, that it takes on its human characteristics. Accompanying this development is a straightening of the embryo described by the word sawa. During this period, the embryo becomes more erect and acquires a more evenly rounded body. Some of the generalized cells of the embryo begin to differentiate into various lines and modify into different functional moieties. This process results in straightening and the formation of organs necessary for viability. As the Qur'an describes, when God created you, then, and the word fa means then, made you even and straight, sawak, and then fa, again, modified you, adalak, and so on. According to the table, and is that on the slide, the table? Showing the different stages. Here's the table which you're referring to. You can see these stages listed along the side here, and you have the shaping stage and so on. These are all correlated with the age and days and the actual size of the embryo. According to this table, which compares the 3 ayat on the stages of development, it is apparent that the Izam stage corresponds with the straightening stage, taswiya. The word sawak in the Quranic statement indicates the following. First, to straighten the position of the body from a bent position, and also to make uneven things leveled. The embryo at the 7th week has a bent back, thus taking the shape of the letter C during the Mudga stage. In the Izam stage, the bending position is straightened and the surface becomes more even due to the disappearance of prominences and depressions. Now the Lam stage, although precursor cells, which we call myoblasts or early muscle cells, are present adjacent to the developing bones. Differentiation into skeletal muscle attachments appears after the ossification process in the shaft and the ends of the bones. I was asked many times, did the bones appear before the muscles? Well, they certainly do. If you want to be logical about it, you wouldn't have muscles until you had something to attach them to. So you have bones and then the muscles. And this is clearly stated in the Qur'an that the bones appear first. A major developmental landmark during the 8th week is the Lam stage, which describes the myogenesis, that is the formation of muscles, which marks the development of the definitive muscles in the trunk and the limbs and the beginning of movement. The muscles take their position around the bones, that is, clothing the bones, and continue the process of straightening and smoothing, tazwiyah. In other words, as the muscles develop, they straighten the embryo up, which the straightening and smoothing which began in the Izam stage. It is now known that the gonads, that is the developing sex glands, differentiate into testes and ovaries at this time, that is during the 8th week, and the Qur'an refers to this development as well. Now the growth stage, or the Nasha stage, the Lam stage represents the end of the embryonic period. We say that the embryonic period ends at the end of the 8th week, and then it becomes the fetal period. So here in this terminology, the Lam stage represents the end of the embryonic period, in other words, the end of the 8th week, during which much of the organogenesis, or the development of the organ, occurs. The Qur'an uses the word, how do we pronounce that, halanga? Yeah, okay. Which translated means made or changed. Okay. In referring to all the embryonic stages. Kalakna, is that how we say it? I can't get my tongue around that one.
Khalaqna.
Khalaqna, okay. Indicates that the new organized tissues are being formed in these stages. However, with the 9th week, the period of fetal development, Nasha, begins. The Qur'an clearly distinguishes the beginning of this period by using the word Ashanu Nafu in the following statement. Then we, Anasha Nafu, cause him to grow and come into being and attain the definitive human form. Anasha Nahu means to initiate, to grow and develop, and to rise and increase. The interpreters of the Qur'an understood the following meanings for the Quranic passage. Development of the fetus into a creature capable of speaking, hearing, and seeing, breathing the spirit into the fetus, and find the characteristics of the Nasha stage. The following characteristics of the Nasha stage are rapid growth and development. And this, again, this chart is from my book. As you can see, in the early stages, the 9th week, 12th, and so on, there's very little growth occurring there. The organs are developing rapidly. And then as you see from the 12th week on, there's very rapid development. And these fetuses are drawn to exact scale so that you can see that the development is very rapid. So it's a period of rapid growth and development, which directly applies with the meaning of Nasha as explained. Directly after the Lam stage, that is the 9th week, until the 12th week, the fetus grows slowly, and then the growth becomes very rapid. There's also change in the nature of the fetus and the development of its organs. The skeleton develops from soft cartilaginous bones to more solid calcified bones, and by the time of 12 weeks gestation, centers of ossification are present in most bones. The limbs become differentiated, and nails can be detected on the fingers and toes. The proportional sizes of the head, body, and limbs change, and their relative proportions become more balanced, particularly between the 9th and 12th weeks. Lanugo hair, that's very fine hair that the fetuses have, and newborn babies have the same. The proportional size of the head and the body and the limbs change, and this hair appears on the skin, which is fully differentiated into the epidermis and hypodermis by the 12th week. The external genitalia begin to differentiate in the 9th week, and also the testes begin their descent, and the internal genitalia develop. At this stage in the 12th week, a male fetus can be distinguished from a female on the basis of its external genitalia. Voluntary and smooth musculature are established. Fetuses at this stage of development reveal or mimic spontaneous movements, and reflex muscular contractions can be elicited by an external stimulus. In general, the overall physiological development of the nervous system parallels the maturation of the brain and the spinal cord. Primitive and instinctive responses, such as sucking and grasping, are subcortical functions and appear much later. Nevertheless, this stage of development represents an important transitional landmark for the fetus because it has reasonably well-coordinated reflexes and movements which can be progressively vigorous in time. And I should say that we can study these stages very easily now in developing humans, because with the techniques of ultrasound and also fetoscopy, you can actually watch these fetuses moving, and you can see that some of them will even begin to suck their thumbs before they're born. Other delicate and subtle developments occur in the fetus, which has changed from its first creation, the embryo, to another one, the fetus, as the Qur'an has described. The third point is that there's extensive and continued development of organ systems. The embryonic period, which ends with the Lam stage, is characterized by the gradual appearance of organs. The fetal period, which follows, is characterized by the preparation of the organ systems to perform their functions, because as soon as the baby is born, it must be able to breathe on its own, it must be able to, its heart must be able to circulate, and all the other organs have to be functional. The fetal period, which follows, is characterized then by the preparation of these organ systems to perform their functions. As the interpreters mentioned, this is the meaning of the Quranic phrase, come into being and attain the definitive form, that is, the human form. And thus the fetus is made into a creature capable of speaking, hearing, and seeing. The fourth part is the acquisition of a soul, and according to the Islamic information, the soul comes to the embryo sometime after the 40 to the 45 days in development, as mentioned in the hadith related by Abdullah ibn Mas'ud. The Prophet, peace be upon him, the truthful and trusted, told us, in every one of you, all components of your creation are collected together in your mother's womb by 40 days. And in that is a nalika like that, then is a mudga like that. Then God sends an angel ordered with 4 instructions. He is told to record his, the human being now developing, deeds, his provision, future benefits, whether he will be miserable or happy, and then the spirit is breathed into him, that is, the soul is acquired. The hadith indicates that there is some delay after the 7th week, according to the use of the word thumma. Embryological studies have not determined the acquisition of a soul to which the Quranic commentators referred. The nature of the soul is generally outside the realm of experimental science and is essentially unknown at this time to mankind. As God says in the Quran, they ask thee concerning the Spirit. Say, the Spirit comes by command of my Lord. Of knowledge it is only a little that is communicated to you, O men. However, what we do know is that there is a difference between life and the soul, although the nature of both is a mystery. A creature with a soul has self-awareness. On the other hand, the sperm and the ovum are alive, since without life they would be unable to participate in fertilization. When the fetus is capable of moving voluntarily from his or her own desire, as opposed to moving reflexly, this could be taken as evidence that he has acquired a soul. During the 10th week of development, for example, the fetus exhibits spontaneous movements and moves in response to stimuli. While these movements may reflect primitive neurological reflexes and do not present conclusive evidence of the presence of a soul, they do indicate that the soul is probably acquired near this time, and this would be in agreement with the time frame presented in the Islamic statements. Now the word ansha nahu, as it is used in the Quran, covers the most apparent external and internal developments and changes in features in this stage of human development. The 3 meanings given for nasha comprehensively apply to this stage. To initiate applies with the initiation of the functioning of various organ systems. For example, the kidneys begin to form urine, blood cells begin to form in the bone marrow, and the hair follicles first appear in the 10th week, and so on, to grow and develop. Applies with the rapid growth and the extensive development of all the organ systems of the body, which occurs during this stage. And to rise and increase applies with the very rapid increase beginning in the 12th week in the length and the weight of the fetus. Therefore, the term nasha appropriately and accurately applies to the fetal period of development. And number 7, the timing of the developmental events. Not only is the sequencing of the embryonic and fetal developments indicated by the order in which they are mentioned in the Qur'an, but also the timing of these events is indicated by the use of the conjunctives fa, which means then, with a little delay, and thumma, which means then with some delay. The occurrences afa and thumma, both of which are translated as then, are as follows. We, God, created man from a quintessence of clay. We then, thumma, placed him as a nutfa, a drop, in a place of settlement, firmly fixed. Then, thumma, we made the nutfa into an alaka, leech-like structure, and then, fa, we changed the alaka into a mudga, chewed-like substance, and then, fa, we made out of that mudga izam, or skeleton or bones. Then, fa, we clothed the skeleton with lam, muscles and flesh. Then, thumma, we caused him to grow and come into being and attain the definitive form, human form. So blessed be God, the best to create. The use of thumma then indicates that there is a delay between the following events. First, the nutfa stage developing into the alaka, first stage of the shaping stage. Lam, the last stage of the shaping, kalak stage, until the development of nasha, the fetal period. During the implantation or hearth phase of the nutfa stage, there is a slow rate of development until the alaka stage. It takes about a week from the beginning of the hearth, that is the day 6, for the connecting stalk to form, day 14, such as the embryo becomes attached and hanging. And it takes about 10 days for the notochord to begin development on the day 16 in order for the embryo to take on the appearance of a leech or an alaka. Thus there is some delay in the formation of the alaka stage. A lot of this is related to developing blood vessels to acquire nourishment from the mother. The nasha or fetal stage can be considered as being in the 9th week, but is delayed in the expression of all its characteristics until later. For example, the period between the beginning of the 9th week and the end of the 11th week is a period of relatively slow growth, and it is not until the 12th week that the rapid growth indicated by Anasha Nahu begins. Additionally, the initiation of development of certain organ systems occurs after the 8th week or after the Lam stage. But the changes in these organs become more apparent after the 11th week. Thus there is a delay until the 12th week for the full expression of nasha, and the word thumma accurately indicates this delay. The word fa indicates that the following stages occur directly after one another. Alaka changing to mudga, mudga changing to izam, izam changing to lam. The embryo of 24 to 25 days is the end of the alaka stage, and it makes a direct change into the mudga stage at 26 to 27 days. The mudga stage lasts until the 6th week, and then changes directly into the izam by the beginning of the 7th week, since the skeleton begins its appearance at that time. The lam stage follows in the 8th week, immediately after the izam stage, since the muscle precursor cells begin their development into muscle as soon as the bone is formed and the muscles can become attached. Thus the word fa is used in the Qur'an to accurately and strongly indicate that these developments follow one another immediately with no delay. Now the conclusions of this study are that the terms which have been used in the Qur'an are very descriptive of developments which occur in the various stages, and they describe these events in their chronological order. Morphological changes that occur with development in each stage are also accurately described by the use of these terms. Because the staging of human embryos is complex, going through a continuous process of change during development, it is proposed that a new system of classification could be developed, using the terms mentioned in the Qur'an and Sunnah. The proposed system is simple, comprehensive, and conforms with present embryological knowledge. The facts about human development that could not have been known by Muhammad, peace be upon him, in the 7th century, because most of them were not discovered until the 20th century. Muslims and others are justified in concluding that these facts could only have been revealed to Muhammad, peace be upon him, by God, who knows all about us, not only about how we develop, but how we live and function. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Moore. I believe, as a listener, that Dr. Moore has given us the best possible abridgment between the physical and the metaphysical. The spiritual and the physical do really meet. I came to this conclusion, and I promised you that you might change your minds about the possibility of having relationship between religion and science. Now, to further our understanding about the subject, we open the questions and answers for Dr. Moore. You would like to... Oh, yeah? Your time. I know you're young, but...
You can ask me any question you like.
Explanation of embryology, what the Qur'an has mentioned. When were you first notified, and after the fact, you have seen how did it affect you in your personal life? And another question follow that: have you become Muslim or have you accepted Islam? Why and why not? Thank you.
That's the question I've been asked, of course, hundreds of times, and it's a very logical question. And I'll give you the same answer that I gave in Saudi Arabia, that I gave in Toronto, that I gave in Sudbury a couple of weeks ago, and that I give anywhere I go. And that is that I was raised in a Christian family. My father was a Presbyterian minister, and he taught me to respect all religions, and he said that all those who believe and worship God just have a different way of doing it. So I have no difficulty in understanding that we all worship the same God. Now, it would be different if I didn't have a strong faith of my own. In other words, if I had been an agnostic and didn't believe strongly in God, that obviously I would have probably accepted your religion. But as I was raised and as a Christian and believe, as you do, that Muhammad was a messenger of God, just as Jesus was a messenger, each bringing messages from God. So I didn't find it difficult when I was told about the Qur'an, that these were revelations from God. It wasn't difficult for me, because my own father made it very clear to me that he was called by God to be a minister, to go and talk about God to the people. So in an indirect way, maybe God is telling me that this is the right thing for me to do, to help explain your holy book to you. Now, your scientific colleagues can do this just as well as I can if they have an understanding of embryology. But I've always said that it's probably mean more as a non-Muslim for me to tell people around the world that I believe that what is recorded in the Qur'an is accurate according to our present knowledge. And as I say, I'm sincere in what I say, is that we just didn't have this knowledge, and some of this knowledge about the genes and the chromosomes has only come to us in the last 10 and 15 years. When I was a student 25 or 30 years ago, we didn't have a lot of the knowledge we have now. And there are a lot of things in the Qur'an that I was asked questions about, and I said, I don't understand it. And I think that maybe in another 100 years, and I won't be here, but on those verses, if you ask them to the embryologists of that day, they will say, sure, that is what this means. So that, to answer your question very simply, I don't feel it's necessary for me to become a Muslim to worship God. I've done that for all of my 60 years. And if anything, though, understanding this just shows me that God has a great influence in this world. That's the best that I can answer that for you. And I have seen some of my colleagues who've been so impressed by what they have read in the Qur'an and so on, that they have certainly, there have been a few cases where they have converted, and that's fine. And if I'm ever so motivated, I would do the same. But I have a strong belief. It just happens to be a little different way of worshiping God than yours, but we're all worshiping the same God, I like to think, and that if we can work together, we'll have a much happier world. Thank you.
Understand that it is during the 10th week when the soul is present in the embryo. Would this mean then that the termination of pregnancy is haram or forbidden only when done during or after these periods, or is there such thing as a degree of haram depending on when abortion is done?
In cases where we detect severe chromosomal abnormalities, and you can detect this now at about 6 weeks, I think it was early, because you can do what we call chorionic villi sampling. Those little villi that you saw in there, you can go in and with a special instrument you can pull off some of these chorionic villi, and you can culture them, and you can determine if they have severe chromosomal abnormalities. And if they do have that, you can determine then that they have no chance of survival. If they have, for example, what we call trisomy 13, where they have an extra 13 chromosome, or they have trisomy 18, another 18 chromosome, those children cannot possibly survive. And there are those who see nothing wrong if you detect that, say, at 5 or 6 weeks of then inducing an abortion. I personally don't have any difficulty with that when it's done very early. That is sort of 6, 7 weeks. But I certainly have strong feelings about abortions that are done even as late as 13 and 14 weeks, which is the common time. In Japan, they're at the present time able to abort up to 24 weeks, which, as you know, is a viable fetus. And I find that just unacceptable. And in fact, I had an interview with a newspaper reporter, and he wanted to know my view, and I didn't. I told him very clearly that I thought this was wrong, and they're thinking of changing their law to bring it back to 20 weeks. I still think that is too late in pregnancy. But I think that I don't know exactly what the Muslim view would be. My feeling is that if it was aborted in those very early stages, before it developed a soul, as they would say, then it might be considered all right. But again, these things are personal decisions which people have to make on the basis of the discussions with their doctor and with their religious people to determine it. And my students always ask me, what would you have done? Well, fortunately, I never had that problem. We had 5 normal children, and but how that's a hypothetical question. But I can often say that knowing what I know now, I don't think that either of us would have considered that the right thing to do. It's a very personal thing. And my own children happen to feel the same way. I don't know why. Maybe it's my influence, I hope.
I would like to know from Dr. Moore, how close the other biblical scriptures or any other religious books, how close do they get to this issue of human reproduction?
Again, I'm not completely familiar with the Old and the New Testament, which I probably should be, although I certainly read a lot when I was a young person. But I have my friends, in fact, one of my nephews who's a clergyman, and he's assured me that there's nothing in the Old or the New Testament other than vague references, but nothing close to what we have here. Because I have put this in both of my embryology books, which are used around the world. The bigger book is in 7 languages legally and 1 illegally. So they're used around the world. I get letters from people saying, there are these references in our holy books too, and those of you who have seen the latest edition, in fairness, I did quote from the Hindu religion where they make some statements about early development. But again, it's back similar to what the early views we had in the 15th and 16th century. So I think that through my contacts, everyone has scanned their own holy books, and I can assure you that if there was anything there that was as good or better, they would be telling me about it because they would want to get international recognition for it. I have been asked why I put that information in my historical section. I said, well, I think it's a part of the history of embryology, and although it's been lost to most people for years, I think it's important that it be recorded there. For those of you that wish more information on this, there is an Islamic edition of, it's really an English edition of my book with Islamic additions. My publisher agreed to allow King Abdulaziz University to print this special edition, but it cannot be sold because, of course, they don't want it sold in competition to the regular English edition. But I think that Sheikh Mustafa Ahmed could arrange for you to get copies of this edition for your libraries. In other words, you can't purchase it, I understand it, in a regular bookstore, but if you need it for your Muslim libraries, you can purchase this. That was the arrangement that was made with my publisher, and that goes into all the details and many more than we've had time to talk about here today.
I would like to thank everybody for being patient and being a good listener. And I would like to thank the MSA for hosting this, and the University of Illinois for hosting this meeting and making it possible.